It's our last edition for the week. Thanks for joining us this hour on The World Today. I'm Joke Rogers. Here's what's coming up. South Korea accuses North Korea of threatening peace after artillery fire near South Korean islands. Plus, Oscar Pistorius released on parole 11 years after being convicted of killing his girlfriend, River Steenkamp. Welcome back to the program. South Korea is accusing North Korea of an act which must be halted immediately after Pyongyang fired more than 200 rounds of artillery shells off its west coast towards the South Yeongyong Island. South Korea ordered civilians to seek shelter on the island before holding live fire drills of its own. The South called it a provocative act, but the North denied the islands were in danger from its firing drills. In 2010, North Korean artillery fired scores of times in Yeongyong Island, killing 4 people. The artillery shells fired on Friday between 0900 to 1100 local time did not enter South Korean territory as they all landed in the buffer zone between the two countries. South Korea's Joint Chiefs of Staff and they said the incident caused no damage to our people or military, but added that the act threatens peace on the Korean peninsula and raises tensions. The shelling follows warnings from Pyongyang that it was building up its military arsenal in preparation for war that could break out at any time on the peninsula. Elsewhere now, a student has shot 6 people, one of them fatally, at a high school in Iowa, United States, before taking his own life on the first day back from holiday break. 5 of those shot were students and 1 a school administrator. The student who died was in 6th grade. Police determined that the suspect, who was later identified as Dylan Butler, a 17-year-old student, was armed with a pump-action shotgun and a small caliber handgun. Investigators also found a rudimentary improvised explosive device at Perry High School, which the police defused. Meanwhile, the United States has officially removed Uganda from the African Growth and Opportunity Act, AGOA, ending Kampala's ability to export certain commodities to the United States duty-free. Uganda joined 3 other African countries such as the Central African Republic, Gabon and Niger Republic, becoming the 4th country to be non-beneficiary of the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act effective from January. U.S. President Joe Biden in October said that Uganda's removal from AGOA was due to the gross violations of internationally recognized human rights. President Biden also noted that the 4 countries had failed to address United States concerns about their non-compliance with the AGOA eligibility criteria, adding that he had determined they do not meet the requirements necessary to allow them to continue benefiting from the trade deal. Let's bring in African Affairs analyst Ibrahim Anaba, who joins us from the University of California. Welcome to the program.
Thanks, Joke. Nice to be with you.
Right, so Ibrahim, first, are you surprised by this move? What's your assessment of the situation?
Well, it's quite unfortunate and an embarrassing sanction because you critically look at it. Who is the sanction targeting? First of all, the bill that the U.S. is condemning here was developed by President Yoweri Museveni and his cabinet members, of course, pushed by politicians in the National Assembly, in Uganda's parliament. So if those are the people at fault here, why then will you impose an economic sanction that will be to the detriment of the people, the Ugandan people, that America is so obsessed about their human rights here? And all said and done, President Museveni, it's not like he has an election to win, or the parliamentarians that pushed this bill. It's not like they have an election to win as well. They will be better off. They are not really bothered. It is the people in Uganda that their livelihood will be so much affected here. So it's a misplaced sanction. If you want to sanction, you target the people at the top, not the general public.
Right, so let's expand it further. You've just said that, this may do nothing for Mr. Yoweri Museveni and, the lawmakers that push for this bill. And it's the people that it's going to affect. So what does this mean exactly for the Ugandan economy? How much hurt is this going to create?
Well, it's going to be quite, it's going to have quite a few consequences. First, you have to understand that Ugandan economy in the last few years has had unemployment gradually increase. In 2013, the unemployment rate was about, I think, 1.9. And now it's about 4.3, 4.5 in 2021. What this means is that there has been a steady increase in unemployment rate in the country. And should there be any radical economic shock, the rate of unemployment could drastically increase, which, of course, Uganda doesn't want. So that is one thing to watch for. But also you have to understand that Uganda's largest export to the US is coffee, vanilla, agricultural products. And agriculture itself employs about 68% of Uganda's labor force, which is tied to about 11% of its GDP, which means if the agricultural sector gets to be affected, then that could have a bad consequence on employment generally in the country. So that's my number one concern for Uganda.
And what about the US? You just listed some of those things that Uganda exports to the US. I suppose that they might not be the only country, getting those across the seas to the United States. But I mean, an aspect of that has been cut off with a sanction. So how is this going to affect those people that were actually getting shipments from Uganda for those products?
Well, I do know quite a few people who are Ugandans who massively benefit from these agreements. I mean, it's been in place since 2000, 23 years ago. So some people's business has been primarily structured around AGOA. But that being said, it's not going to pretty much affect the US anyways, because what the US import from Uganda the most, coffee, vanilla, it can always get those from Brazil, Colombia, and vanilla from Indonesia. So it's not really bothered about Uganda. However, the critical thing here is the hypocrisy of the US government. Remember, when these agreements was put in place in 2000, there were gross violations of human rights in Uganda. President Museveni has been in power since 1986. A huge part of that time in power has had record of human rights violation. In 2020, just about 3 years ago, there was a massacre in Uganda. About 54 people died. These were opposition political supporters, and thousands of people were jailed. In 2020, America did not say it was going to remove Uganda from the list then. So why now? Why with this homosexuality bill? Well, it gives the impression that America is particularly concerned about certain human rights, not just all human rights. The same American government that is supporting regime change, genocide across the world, is one that seems to be having this moral ground, pushing it on African countries. Of course, we know that the homosexuality bill is appalling. It has to be thrown out by the Ugandan government. But the US shouldn't seem to claim a morality high ground over African countries here. So it's not going to be an economic problem for the US to remove Uganda. However, it shows some level of hypocrisy.
So be that as it may, what can African countries do to be in charge of their own affairs without fear of offending developed nations? Certainly, the US is the bigger power here, as you've just stated.
That's true. So this shows that our governments across the continent needs to focus more inwardly. We have the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement, which is pushed to be a game changer. It's going to change the economic fortune of Africa. So we need to trade internally with ourselves. Uganda needs to look more towards just beyond Kenya and Uganda and look at other neighboring countries with whom to trade. And less priority should be given to the US or any European trade partners. Because again, if you are trading more with your African colleagues, when such sanctions as the US is pushing now comes up, you're going to have less vulnerability to it. So it's a wake-up call, but it's also necessary for us to tell Uganda that this is an example of what you're going to get if you keep being a gross violator of human rights. We know the case of Bobby Wine, the opposition leader who has been persecuted for many years by President Yoweri Museveni. Uganda is currently ranked 123 out of 165 countries on the Human Freedom Index. 123 out of 165. That's a poor class performance. So we can't really neglect the fact that Uganda has been a bad haven for human rights, for civil rights societies, civil rights organizations in the last 2 decades or whatnot. However, it's time for us to focus on internal trade, AFCFTA, and also remind Uganda that this is the kind of attitude it's going to get if it's continuing to violate human rights.
Right. And finally, to you, this is just the beginning of 2024. We're just, trying to finish the first week of the new year. African presidents, African leaders, what should be our priorities going into the new year on the back of the fact that, we just spoke about managing our own affairs and not being, fearful of bigger powers. But what are the things that we should be prioritizing aside the one that you just mentioned?
Yeah, so that's a very relevant question, Joke. So we saw in last year that coups were just pretty much one of the most predominant problems we have to deal with in Africa. I mean, ECOWAS was pretty much being condemned for the way it handled the coup in Niger, and he aimed generally for other coups on the continent. But we now know that coups just do not happen overnight. That is a culmination of different economic and political instabilities that comes together to push the military into power. So if we can focus on, one, respecting the dignity and human rights of our citizens, starting with Uganda and others, then that's going to solve one part of the problem. But also economic reforms that start with fixing corruption and having more open trade internally, respecting entrepreneurs on the continent, and just not throwing them in jail or condemning them because they disagree with you politically or because they are not from your region. That's part of the reasons why President Museveni has been floated as a dictator on the continent for many years, because he seems to be concerned about a particular set of Ugandans that are the proper citizens, and some other Ugandans like Bobby Wine or the so-called homosexuals are not proper citizens. And that is not a way to govern your country. If you do not want to have a military coup, if you don't want to have a political instability or sanctions, you should respect the dignity of your people. And Uganda is pretty much a case in point for the rest of the continent.
Right, Ibrahim, thank you for your time today.
Thank you.
Hundreds of student demonstrators took to the streets of Sao Paulo in Brazil today in protest against an increase in rail fares on metro trains. Footage shows demonstrators marching with flags and banners amid a heavy police presence. The protest comes following a decree by the regional governor Tarcísio de Freitas after ticket prices on metro trains in Sao Paulo reportedly rose from 4.4 Brazilian reals to 5 Brazilian reals. That's roughly 0.93 euro or 0.93 euros on January the 1st. Many people in Sao Paulo see the price increase in connection with de Freitas' plans for privatization in the public transport sector. In October, hundreds of metro and train workers staged a 24-hour strike against what they describe as the regional government's privatization agenda. With geopolitical tensions rising around the world, 2024 is set to become an uneasy year for businesses and consumers. In the past, Germany's economy had been a bedrock for safe, sound, and stable growth, but that doesn't seem to be the case really this year. Well, the start of this year. For more on this, we're joined by DW's Mattis Richmond in Berlin. Matt, it's great to see you today. Germany is still one of the richest economies globally. So what's up with a gloomy outlook for 2024?
Yeah, it's true. Germans are among the top earners of economic growth around the world and have some of the lowest poverty rates. The problem is the economic model of the past year is squeaking. So let's briefly think about the past year of economics in Germany. Rising prices here saw people go to the shops less, and many of the manufacturing companies here grew quite weary of the enormous energy costs in Germany, putting investments on hold or shifting them to other countries. And lastly, just over the past couple of months, a huge government crisis erupted because of a ruling of the Constitutional Court here that had the three-party government impose budget cuts, putting the country's ambitious plan for a green transition at risk. So that's sort of the situation we find ourselves in at the start of the year. A lot of insecurity around how the economy will play out, not really the kind of environment you happily go to the shops, buy a house, or invest in a new business stream.
You just mentioned this constitutional court ruling that threw the government into upheaval. Does this have broader implications than only for Germany?
Well, yeah, the short answer is yes. It threatens growth here, and that means Germany isn't buying things from other countries, especially EU countries. The thing about this court ruling is that it disallowed the reallocation of government funds that were initially earmarked for COVID policies. The government then wanted to reuse this money for climate-friendly industrial policy, and that move was ruled unconstitutional. The problem is this practice is used in other budgetary areas of the federal government as well, and also on the lower state levels. So the implications of these decisions aren't all clear yet. But the government already expects economic output to drop due to the budget reshuffle. These politics around debt are a very, very German phenomenon, and most economic experts agree that there need to come big changes in 2024 so that the government here can actually take on more debt to do industrial policy, that is to transition Germany towards a greener industry, for example, by betting big on hydrogen as a new energy source for power-hungry manufacturing here.
So, Matthias, what do the forecasts say where Germany's economy is headed in 2024?
So it's actually really a mixed bag, but not very upbeat bag. While officials like the European Commission and the German government expect marginal growth, many of the private sector analysts even expect a recession in 2024. There's a nice analogy Marz Kramer, chief economist at a state bank, spoke about. He compared the German economy to a corrugated sheet of metal. It moves up and down a little bit, but basically lies flat on the ground. Other experts have raised larger points of saying Germany's bets on cheap Russian gas, on exports to China, and on outsourcing national security to the US have come to an end, raising the uncertainty many people here are feeling, which is basically makes that consumers and businesses are in a waiting pattern.
Right. Welcome back. 11 mine workers have been trapped in an underground shaft following a ground collapse at Red Wing mine in Zimbabwe, located 270 kilometers of the capital, Harare. Authorities from Zimbabwe's Mines Ministry on Friday said the incident occurred on Thursday morning, with preliminary assessments suggesting that earth tremors may have triggered the collapse. Red Wing's mines owner, Metalon Corporation, has issued a separate confirmation of the incident and reveals that a dedicated rescue team has been mobilized to bring the trapped miners back to the surface. According to the company, subsistence miners have carried out the mining operations at Red Wing, engaged in unauthorized work since the mine was placed under corporate rescue in 2020. Over in South Africa, where Paralympian Oscar Pistorius has been freed on parole from jail nearly 11 years after being convicted of murdering his girlfriend, Riva Steenkamp. Officials confirmed Mr. Pistorius was at home on Friday morning, having served half of his more than 13-year sentence. Pistorius, now 37 years, shot Ms. Steenkamp multiple times in 2013 through a door. The double amputee later claimed he had mistaken her for a burglar. He was eventually convicted of murder in 2015 after an appeal court overturned an earlier verdict of culpable homicide. Under South African law, all offenders are entitled to be considered for parole once they have served half their total sentence, which for Pistorius was finally set in 2017 at 13 years and 5 months. He will live under strict conditions, including being unable to speak to the media until his sentence expires in 2029. In Senegal, the Supreme Court has rejected opposition leader Ousmane Sonko's appeal against a libel conviction, potentially ruling him out of next month's presidential election. After about 12 hours of hearing, the Supreme Court earlier on Friday rejected Mr. Sonko's appeal against the libel conviction. According to electoral regulations, the conviction disqualifies him from the 25th February presidential race. However, his legal team say the legal setback is not final. Mr. Sonko is seen as a strong potential challenger in the race to succeed President Macky Sall, who is stepping down after 2 terms. He has faced several court cases since 2021, all of which he denies. Last month, the court ordered his reinstatement on the electoral roll. His repeated arrests over the past 2 years have sparked several bouts of deadly arrests in one of West Africa's most stable democracies. Reports say there's no immediate sign of public protests in response to Friday's ruling, even as the Constitutional Council is set to publish a final list of cleared presidential candidates on the 20th of January. In the meantime, the United Nations has issued a stark warning about the deteriorating situation in Sudan, emphasizing the urgent need for international intervention. UN spokesperson Stephanie Tremblay spoke about Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs Martin Griffiths' warning that the 9 months of war there has tipped Sudan into a downward spiral that only grows more ruinous by the day. Ms. Tremblay revealed that nearly 25 million people in Sudan require humanitarian assistance, but escalating hostilities are hindering aid efforts.
Between Daglo and Sudan Military Chief General Abdel.
In a statement that you may have seen that was issued earlier today, the Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, Martin Griffiths, warned that 9 months of war there has tipped the country into a downward spiral that only grows more ruinous by the day. Across Sudan, nearly 25 million people will need humanitarian assistance this year, but escalating hostilities are putting most of them beyond our reach. Mr. Griffiths called on the parties to the conflict to protect civilians, facilitate humanitarian access, and stop the fighting immediately. He said that in 2024, the international community, particularly those with influence on the parties to the conflict in Sudan, must take decisive and immediate action to stop the fighting and safeguard humanitarian operations meant to help millions of civilians.
A former beauty queen in Namibia is reiterating her pledge to run for president of the southern African country. Cassia Sharpley, who became Miss Namibia in 2022, has told her 23,000 Instagram followers that she would soon share her journey towards becoming president of the Republic of Namibia. Although several followers pointed out that presidential candidates must be over 35 in keeping with the Namibian constitution, the 23-year-old Miss Sharpley repeated her statement on Thursday. Ms. Sharpley, who plans to run as an independent candidate, added that she would offer more information in the forthcoming YouTube feeds. And finally on the program, Russia's first giant panda cub has probably had enough rest for, or maybe just a little bored, as it can be seen trying to get out of its playpen to let loose. Footage shows the adorable and feisty cub climbing up to a wooden bar and learning to walk around the enclosure. This is Moscow's zoo first giant panda cub, which was born on August the 30th, while the panda's parents, Ding Ding and Rui, were brought to Moscow from Beijing in 2019. Giant pandas are native to China, with a few leased to other countries for conservation purposes. Ding Ding and Rui are part of a scientific initiative aimed at preserving and breeding the rare species. Well, that's our program today. Thank you for watching. I'm Joke Rogers.